Today we're going to be discussing how to crush small stakes tournaments, and I'm going to be sharing with you 3 post-flop tips to help you crush the players that you are likely to encounter in the small stakes tournaments. Before we get started, I always recommend learning to play good, strong, fundamentally sound poker like we teach here on mypokercoaching.com. However, you need to make a point to adjust to whatever your opponents do incorrectly in order to take advantage of the mistakes that they or the player pool in general will make. And these 3 tips today are going to be exploitative plays to help you take advantage of things that your opponents in the small stakes games will almost certainly do incorrectly. Now, every single player you play against is not going to exhibit these mistakes, but a lot of them will. So, first, bet when checked 2. Why? Because many small stakes players bet and raise when they have a premium hand. When they think they have the best hand, they do not slow play. They bet it, they raise it, they re-raise it, whatever. However, when they check or when they just call your bet, they usually do not have a very good hand because they would have raised it. So that means they are way more likely to have a marginal hand, a draw, or nothing. And if you know they have a marginal hand, a draw, or nothing, you can just look to apply pressure whenever they check. And especially against some players, you can find yourself in spots where you will win the pot almost every time. For example, say you raise with whatever, and the big blind calls, and the flop comes 8-7-2, 2 spades. They check, you continuation bet with whatever you have, and they call. If they had 3 of a kind, or 2 pair, maybe even top pair, top kicker, or an overpair, they would have raised you immediately. So you can just remove all of those from their potential range. So they have something like top pair marginal kicker and worse made hands or draws. Say the turn is a jack or a queen or a king or whatever. They check, you should bet again. Now, you certainly could be against 2 pair or maybe a straight if that's possible or a very good hand still. But if you do bet and they have one of those, again, they're going to raise you. And if they raise you, of course, get out of the way. But you are now applying immense pressure to their marginal draws and their marginal made hands, like middle pair or third pair. So you can again continue applying pressure. Say the river is really any card, besides maybe a 7 or 6. What was the board? 7-6 blank, 8-7 blank, whatever it is. Say the board does not pair on the river. If they check, you can continue betting again, even if a draw comes in. Because a lot of these players will lead into you if they have a draw because they're afraid that you're going to let it go check. So if they're going to lead with their good hands, you can again remove those from their range and you can apply aggression. Now, what a lot of people do wrong is they don't apply enough aggression. They bet a third pot on the flop, a third pot on the turn, and a third pot on the river. But if you do that, your opponents will call you with middle pair. Instead, you have to go something like a third pot on the flop, half pot on the turn, and then pot or 1.5x pot, or maybe all in on the river. Essentially, you want to take your opponent's most likely hand type, which are marginal made hands or nothing, and put them in a spot where they just cannot call unless they want to make some absurd hero call. And most players in the small stakes games are not playing to try to make an absurd hero call, especially at, really in any stage of the tournament. So you can look to apply a lot of aggression when they check. Now again, this is not the game theory optimal strategy because good players will protect their checking ranges by including some very good hands they're just never folding. And they won't go around folding hands like top pair. So they won't raise top pair and they'll call down with it. And that makes them way more difficult to bluff in this manner. But if your opponents will play straightforwardly and raise and bet and re-raise, etc., with their good hands, this is a powerful strategy that will result in you winning a lot of small pots. And when they do raise you, you just get out of the way. Next, you're going to want to apply aggression when you have the nut advantage. What is the nut advantage? It means that you have a lot of very strong hands in your range that your opponent cannot have. When your opponent's range is capped, meaning they have something like middle pair and worse, and yours is not, you want to apply aggression. And again, many players will check raise with their best hands, allowing you to bet very aggressively when they check and call. Say you know your opponent likes to raise when they have a strong draw. That's just what they do. And this will be the case for some players. Say there is a flush draw on the flop. They check, you bet, they call. Right here, you can already remove a lot of flush draws from their range because they would have raised them. So say the flush comes in on the turn or the river and they check, you don't really need to be afraid of that. If anything, that should make you far more inclined to bluff because you know they probably don't have a flush, but you could have the flush because you would bet the flop with flush draws, and obviously you'd keep betting the turn and or the river with the flush, right? So this is a spot where you can continue applying aggression and get your opponent to fold all sorts of marginal made hands, which will be a large chunk of their range. Another example comes up when the turn or the river is a high card that they probably don't have in their range, but you certainly do. Say you raise from first position and the big blind calls and the flop comes 7-4-2. They check, you bet with whatever, they call. If the turn is an ace, a king, or a queen, this is a spot where they're not going to check call the flop with too many ace highs, king highs, or queen highs. Maybe they will call some ace highs, but remember, you have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, all the best aces in your range. So, in this scenario, you can continue betting on the high card turns and probably blast it on the river because they're not going to have top pair, good kicker, and better. And to make matters even better, they're probably going to raise if they turned two pair. So, they're going to have something like middle pair and worse. And if you can find spots where you have a lot of really good nut hands in your range and your opponents do not, there's not much they can do besides fold because your range is so much stronger compared to theirs. And even if your opponents don't understand this point from a game theory optimal point of view, they will intuitively get it, right? They'll realize if they have 7-6 on 7-4-2 king, and they check call the flop, and then you bet again on the turn, they're going to be sick about it. Now, they may call, but if they do call, and they don't make two pair or three of a kind on the river, and they check, and you bet big, they're going to give you the pot. Now, look, again, if your opponent's a calling station and they don't give you the pot, you see them call you down, take a note on that player and do not bluff them. Instead, value bet them relentlessly and thinly, because against those players, they're just not going to fold, and you can extract massive amounts of value from hands that you perhaps normally wouldn't be able to, like ace 7 on 7-4-2 king. That's the spot where maybe you can't bet the river for full value, but if you know they're going to call with all sorts of nonsense like a 7 or a 4, then certainly you can. Finally, tip number 3 is to overfold to lots of aggression. Most small stakes players do not like to go broke. They go to the casino, perhaps not even to try to win the tournament or to get in the money. They are there to try to pass time and hang out. And you know how you don't hang out? It's by bluffing off your stack. So, because of this, they do not bluff nearly often enough. So when they do apply a substantial aggression, you're going to want to overfold with your bluff catchers, which are your hands that only beat bluffs. To be clear, a bluff catcher is not a hand that beats some value hands. For example, say you have top pair, top kicker. You bet the flop, your opponent calls. On the turn, it's a scary card, whatever. It goes check, check. On the river, if your opponent bets, and you think they would value bet top pair marginal kicker, you can't really go around folding top pair, top kicker because you beat their marginal value hands that would value bet that are behind yours, as well as all the bluffs. When you beat value hands and bluffs, you have a pretty easy call. Now, if your opponent will literally never bluff and they have just a few worse value hands and all the better ones, then maybe you can still justify folding. But if you have a pure bluff catcher that really can only beat bluffs, most players in most games, even the high stakes games, don't bluff often enough. And because of that, you should be getting out of the way. And to take this to the extreme, if your opponent is actually a super nitty player, super tight player, you can make really big folds against them. For example, say you have pocket aces and you raise and the big blind calls and it comes 8-7-3. Say they check, you bet, they call. Say the turn is 4, 8-7-4-3. They check. This is a spot where you should not be afraid of the random straights and two pairs. They could have it, but they probably don't. They could easily have top pair, middle pair, a draw, whatever. So, they check, you bet again. If a tight, straightforward player now raises you on 8-7-4-3, your aces should fold right into the muck. No problem. Why? Because you're value betting to get value from lots of worse hands. Ace 8, king 8, queen 8, jack 8, 10 8, 9 8, all the sevens, straight draws, etc. But when this tight, straightforward player raises, they are not bluffing you. And on top of that, they're not going to think all of a sudden now queen 8 is the nuts, right? Because they recognize that you could have aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, three of a kind, right? So for them to raise in this spot, they are going to have a really, 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 really good hand that beats aces. This is something that results in a lot of small stakes players not ever winning because they just blindly pay off their straightforward opponents every single time they get set up, let's call it, when you have an overpair and your opponent can beat your overpair. There's a lot of value to be had by not paying off your opponents when they do hit their implied odds hands. And alternatively, you can get a lot of value early in the tournament by playing suited, connected type stuff against players who will never, ever, ever fold aces. I mean, every time I play, call it a main event, where there are a lot of players who are playing above their means, very often I'm just playing lots of suited, connected type hands, especially in position. And I'm trying to make a hand that can beat pocket aces because I know a lot of these players cannot fold aces, especially against Jonathan Little, YouTube personality, loose aggressive player, right? I'm the type of player who they think will try to bluff them. Don't tell them this. Instead, I just sit there and try to make the nuts. And when I make the nuts, I load the money in. They don't fold aces, and I get a double up early in a lot of these main events because if I ever get a good hand and I happen to run into aces, I'm going to stack them. So you want to make sure that you are not paying off the players who are using that strategy. And a lot of players in the small stakes games use that strategy. So that's it. 3 tips to crush the small stakes games. Number 1, bet when check 2 because people bet and or raise with their good hands. Next, apply aggression when you have the nut advantage. This is just good poker, but especially in the small stakes games, a lot of players get scared when they have middle pair or worse, and they know you have a whole lot of better hands. And then finally, overfold to lots of aggression. If your opponents are kind of straightforward and they all of a sudden want to put in all their money, well, you should not want to put in your money. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, click the like and subscribe button below. If you have a friend who you think would benefit from these 3 tips, please share it with them. We do a lot of work to make great content for mypokercoaching.com. And even one share with one of your friends goes a very, very long way. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I'll talk to you next time.